Welcome to the Discovery Pod, where we talk to leading experts from the University of Adelaide about solutions to society's most pressing challenges. Single-use plastics will be banned Australia-wide from the year 2025. But will we be prepared for these changes? To discuss this topic, I'm joined by Professor Rachel Burton, a plant molecular biologist with a strong interest in emerging crops, and Professor Jian Zuo, expert in sustainable construction. So to begin this discussion, Rachel, can we explain the new changes in relation to single-use plastics?
So one of the changes has already happened. So from the 1st of March in South Australia, 3 types of single-use plastics were banned. So this is plastic drinking straws, plastic one-use cutlery, so knives and forks, and then those little stirrer things that you get for your coffee. So those are the 3 that have been phased out now. We've done this in South Australia. I think Queensland will follow suit in about September. And then next year, polystyrene items will be essentially phased out. So these are plates, cups, bowls, those clamshell containers that you get for your takeaway food, etc. So they're next in the firing line next year. And then, as you said, 2025, we hope that the whole of Australia will be single-use plastic free.
So how do they practically make that happen? Is there a fine if you buy single-use plastics, or are they just stopped? Have they just kind of been banned to even be produced in the first place?
So I think they're mainly aiming at suppliers and retailers now, so that those items won't be available. You just can't buy them. You can buy them still, or they are available. So if for health reasons you need to use straws, so they'll be available in health centres and for people that do need them. But I think, eventually we just won't be able to get them. So if you go into the supermarket, for example, to buy single-use cutlery, they'll be made from different materials, and that's where, that innovation comes in to try and find replacements. I think it's going to be interesting when we go to the grocery store with the supermarket, because, you've got to put your apples in something. So those single-use plastic bags that we're so fond of will go as well. So South Australians are very good at using reusable shopping bags, but what about those single-use plastic bags? We'll have to find alternatives for those.
Right, so that's a big change and quite a tight goal time frame. 2025 will come very quickly, I'm sure. Do you think we're ready for those changes? Do we have sustainable alternatives?
I think we're ready. There has been an amazing explosion of alternatives, and lots of people are working very hard on this, and some of the stuff that's coming out is really smart. And I think, if it keeps going the way it's going, it's going to be really, really good, and I think we should be able to do it. We've got plenty of resources and plenty of smart people around to be able to do it.
Yeah, and South Australia seems like the perfect place to begin.
It does.
We've got lots of ideas, and we're all pretty compliant when it comes to the environment. So can you describe some of those new developments that are happening? What are the projects, and what kind of materials are they using?
So I can give you an example of 3 projects and sort of at different scale. One's really local, so one's a very small startup company called Mr. Rye in South Australia, and they essentially have been looking at how to replace single-use plastic straws. And you could argue that you can replace plastic with paper, but there's still issues with paper, and we probably don't really want to be using trees to make straws. And so they've gone back to cereal crops. And cereal crops, so if you think about, how wheat or rye or barley grow, they have a stalk and then they have the head on the top with the grain, and we use the grain, we eat that. But you can use the stalk because it's hollow and it's like a straw.
Right.
Who knew, right?
Nature's straw.
Nature's straw. So what they've done is they've used rye because it's quite strong. They've checked to make sure it's gluten-free and that they can sterilise it, and they're available now, and cafes and places can buy boxes of these straws made by Mr. Rye. So
they're thick enough.
They're thick enough, yeah. I don't think the diameter gets very broad, but most liquids. I don't think really thick liquids, like maybe really thick
shake.
milk. Yeah, then probably
Wendy's
not.
thick shake
Probably not. You might need a paper straw for that one.
Yeah.
But most things will go through those quite easily. So that's a very local example. Another example that I can give you, which is Australia-wide, products made by a company called I Am Not Paper. And these are disposable cups and things that we need for hot beverages, and they basically are using vegetable pulp, not paper, not trees, because we don't want to be cutting down forests. We'd go from one disaster from another if we go from plastic to then using more of our forests to make these products. So they're using pulp, which is basically cellulose and some of those compounds. And it's similar to making paper, but they're using similar technology, but they've sort of tweaked it to use these vegetable fibres. And for example, we're using those in you can see them in some of the outlets around the university. Right. And they've got a little stamp on them that says I am not paper, and they use vegetable inks if they want to make, put logos and things on them. So that's another sort of South Australian example. And then the last one I can give you is much more global, and it's IKEA. Right. And they've been really innovative. So they've obviously, all this flat pack furniture has to be packaged so that it stays safe and we don't get it all in a bashed up state. So they've really concentrated on their two main packaging items. So one is that they now use cardboard, which is corrugated, so that gives strength, but it's made of 80% recycled cardboard already, and it can be further recycled. So that's one great thing that they're doing. But the one that really caught my eye is this thing called myco-composite, which is actually a packaging material made out of fungus or mushrooms, right? I mean, that's what we're familiar with, the mushrooms. And they take a vegetable fibre or a plant material like hemp or oat hulls or rice hulls or whatever, and pack it into a mould, and then they seed the fungus into the mould and get it to grow through all the material, and the mycelium actually sort of forms this net that keeps everything together.
Really?
Yeah, and then they heat treat it to make sure that the fungus, there's no spores left, and that's what they use, and it's completely biodegradable.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's incredible. And because IKEA are a big name in something like furniture, they're leading the way, and they're saying, well, this is possible, and they're swapping all their stores over. I think there's over 400 around the world. So there's a really global solution that's happening now.
That's awesome to hear. A lot of these processes, it sound like, take plant material, a material that we're quite familiar with, and then take it through a process to turn it into a packaging solution. Is that process economical and ecological in itself? I can imagine it requires a bit of energy and processing. Is it sustainable with the very process of that?
I think we have to be careful. It's sustainable. We shouldn't jump, out of the frying pan into the fire and just say, well, just because we're using something that comes from plants, it's better. You have to look at all of the levels of energy expenditure, environmental cost, where the materials are coming from, how they're disposed of, all those things. And you've got to sort of really hook into that circular economy and make sure that you're actually doing something that's not making the problem worse. And you do have to spend energy to pull these things apart. But, can it be green energy, for example?
Yeah.
Can we use recycled materials as well as new materials? And, really, what is the environmental cost of this? And some of it's not really tangible. So, even though it might not look like it's sustainable from an economic point of view, if that's what customers are looking for and that's what customers are going to buy, and it gives that X factor for a company, well, maybe it's worth investing in making those options available. So I think there's a lot of things to think about. It's quite complicated, but hopefully, as we get more used to it, and as we get better at the processes, they'll get cheaper and easier, and we'll start thinking about how we can use the materials around us better.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's a real space for creativity.
It is, yeah.
So as a plant molecular biologist, where do you fit within that process? What's your role?
So I'm very interested in being able to use the materials that grow on this planet. So we have a massive biomass. Every year we get some huge amount of what's called cellulosic biomass that grows. So 180 billion tonnes or something ridiculous. And, we're not using a lot of that. So can we use that better? Can we recycle things, in sustainable ways? And can we use crops that are sort of, for multifunction? So we don't just use one part of a plant, we use all the parts of the plant. And a good way to give an example is I'm very interested in hemp. So that's a new crop that's coming, and it's got really good fibres, which we can use in all sorts of materials. And I'm sure that you might know about, the construction industry are using them.
We'll
and
definitely get onto
that. So, but we can use the seeds for food. They're highly nutritious. We can use it's a medicinal plant as well, so there's options there. We can use it for fibre, we can use it to make into plastics, we can use it in this material that's being made by IKEA. We can use the whole plant. So, and that makes the inputs that you need to grow the plant cheaper, and they get, more economical. So what can we do with materials that we're used to? How can we reframe them and repurpose them and use them? Yeah. So that's where I get really excited about what we can do with these materials. Don't throw it away. How can we use it?
Yeah, well, hemp sounds so versatile, as are a lot of other and what you've called emerging crops. Can you explain some other crops that you're particularly interested in and why?
So another crop that I'm really excited about is agave. And some people will say, okay, well, I know agave because we use it to make spirits. So in Mexico, some agave is used to make tequila. So that's what everybody's familiar with. But agave is an amazing plant. It doesn't need that much water to survive in our environment. It grows very happily in Australia because it's hot and dry. But what's left with all the bits and pieces once you've squeezed out all the sugar to make the alcohol? And actually, agave sisal is what we make sisal from, which is rope. Oh. So all those fibres have been used for centuries to make materials. So is hemp, of course, since whenever, thousands of years ago. So agave is something that we could probably use not only for human consumption in alcohol. We could use to make energy, but we could also use it for bioplastics. We can use the fibres for materials. We can use the biomass to make really good animal feed. It's fire retardant. There's all these things that we can actually use it for, and repurposing or looking at the waste and saying, okay, it's not waste. What can we do with it next? And sort of getting that pipeline in place is, really exciting with these new crops.
Turning trash into treasure, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there's one other crop I remember you mentioning.
Yeah, so I work on plantago as well, which makes psyllium, which is we're probably familiar with it because lots of people take it as a fibre, as a dietary fibre, and it's used in gluten-free foods. But one of the things that you can do with it, again, you can use it for biofilms, you can use it as a drug disintegrant. And it's a natural organic, and if you grow it in Australia, it's grown here. So there's different things that you can do with the different components of the plant. So.
And all of this is really with the purpose of creating some sustainable solutions that will cover us when the single-use bans come in, and other reasons as well. Is there any thing that consumers will have to sacrifice, or I guess compromise on, in order to see this happen and use these alternatives as opposed to what we're used to?
So I guess we're quite lazy. We go in the supermarket and we buy things that are already pre-packaged. Things arrive in the post, or we go. Everything's got plastic around it. Do we actually need to have clear packaging, for example? Do we actually need to see what's in the box, or can we use cardboard more effectively? And I think there's a lot of companies going towards having very simple, plain packaging. It's still strong enough so that whatever you've got doesn't get bashed around inside. Yeah. So maybe we're going to have to shift our perception of what's reasonable. We're going to have to get a little bit less lazy and take maybe bags to the supermarket to reuse. So again, the single-use plastics that are going to disappear are going to be those thin plastic bags. And I think we're just going to have to get more mindful of what packaging is made of, where it goes, how we can be better. And I think that it's been used for many years now, but reduce, reuse, recycle is as valid now as it ever has been. And I think, if we develop that sort of awareness of what we're doing, then I don't think we're going to have to compromise. Anything that is packaging for food is going to have meet safety regulations, so, we won't be at risk. There's going to have to be some clever, innovative people, because some food stuffs are wet, so what do you do with some of these packaging? But I think we're up to the challenge, and I think consumers will welcome, being able to actually make changes on a small scale so that they feel like, they're not just helpless.
Yeah, that's such a good point. What springs to my mind is shelf life for some of these packaging solutions. Is that going to change? Will we have to become more used to, updating our packaging on a more regular basis, or will that not be compromised?
So I think that some things that have short shelf life are not going to be a problem, but don't forget we don't just have plastic in our society, we also have glass. Yeah. And tins and other packaging materials. So some of those things aren't going to have to change. Mm-hmm. I think it might be a challenge to try and package wet things. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I know that some of these single-use cutleries that are made of different materials will start to disintegrate after 30 minutes. So you have to eat your meal before your fork starts melting into your dinner. True. But I think there's going to be enough variety that we will be able to cope with things like shelf life.
Right, that's so exciting. That's a huge improvement in our community coming up in the next few years.
I hope so. I look forward to it. It's going to be exciting to see what we come up with.
Yeah, well, thank you for your involvement in that. That's really exciting. That's right. And Jian, you are from the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the Uni of Adelaide. Can you describe to us some of the ways in which the construction industry is becoming more sustainable?
Sure. Construction industry play a quite important role in achieving sustainability goal in any kind of scale, from building to community to city to the whole nation. If we take a piece of brick as example, if you look at from the very beginning, we dig a certain amount of clay out, mm-hmm. and then we send to a factory, and we use a lot of energy and water to make it a piece of brick. And then we send it to the warehouse, and we send to the site and put them together in a nice looking house. 30, 40, 50 years later, we may choose to knock it down. I'm not advocating for that, but some people choose to do that. And then that brick, in many cases, been broken, and then will be, sorry to say that, but in many cases been sent to the landfill because it cannot be reused again. Having said that, there are some businesses are trying to reuse the brick. So what they do is they just connect the brick and just clean the mortar, and then essentially can be reused again. But quite a large percentage of the construction waste being sent to the landfill are those masonry waste like bricks, concrete, etc. So as you can see, the whole process is quite energy intensive. Also, we use quite a lot of water. And timber is a quite good alternative that essentially is a carbon sink, whereas the metal ones like aluminum, steel, they are very much energy intensive in the production space. So we use a lot of energy during that space. So these kind of materials have a lot of carbon carbon emission built into that. So that's the reason this waste and also the environmental aspect has drawn a lot of attention. A lot of initiatives have been put forward, like Green Building Council Australia has a rating tool for green buildings, has been specifying the percentage of the material to be reused in the project and get a certain amount of credits, for example, which is quite nice. Mm-hmm. So if the client wants to say, we want 6-star Green Star building, they can simply specify that to the engineers and architects saying, we want this 20-30% percentage of the materials are reused or recycled from elsewhere. So there's a challenge and there's a solution. So, but if you look at that, back to 20-30 years ago, what we've been putting together, we're still very nice looking house over there, building over there. It's just a matter of people's mindset about how we can treat these kind of buildings and also treat those materials coming out of the construction and demolition processes to make it more environmentally sustainable.
Right. And does that process cost a little bit extra for the builder? Having those 6 stars or 5-star?
There are general percentage. There's a lot of different studies. So the figure range from probably 10% to 30% of the capital cost, which means the cost putting together. But that's why I think Rachel was also talking about the costing, that it's not necessarily about the cost we put this in together, but also long-term perspective, that 30, 40 years later, if we talk about, environmental tax to be introduced, that could be changed the entire space. Well, you probably have heard this landfill levy has been updated, so it has been increased to about $144 per ton.
Right, so can you describe that landfill levy a little bit more?
Sure, so if we build a house, for example, and normally we have like a skip bin, and so the builder can put everything generated, waste generated from the process to input into the bin.
Right.
And at the end of the day, somebody will come to pick up the bin, and we'll look at what's inside the bin. If it's recyclable, it'll be sent to the recycling plant, like a timber, even some of the concrete, the steel bar, reinforced concrete bars can be reused, recycled. But for still quite a lot actually being sent to the landfill. So what they do is they send to the what they call the weight bridge of the recycling business. So they can check if it's clean or unclean. And if this has to be sent to the landfill, they just weight the amount, like 1,000 tons, for example, and then just times of $144 per ton. So they actually have a big bill to be paid.
So there's a huge incentive to reduce the waste.
Absolutely.
And I can imagine that does tie quite nicely to packaging, because there'd be huge amounts of packaging involved in that process. Glass panes, things that need to be secure and safe.
Oh yeah, and the doors, windows.
Yeah.
If you notice that, let me think, the Urban Nest student apartments, they use quite a lot of window products that have the glass and frames all together.
Yeah.
So as a result, they have to be very careful in the transportation not to break it. So to prevent any damage during the transportation, they actually have wrapped it up by plastic quite heavily. We've seen probably not 3, not 4, probably 5 layers of plastic wrapping, just try to prevent any damage of that.
So there is a real incentive to find alternatives for that, even just to decrease the landfill levy, and of course all the benefits for the environment as well. Right, so can you describe some other techniques and initiatives involved in the recycled plastic space in the construction industry?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about a couple of examples. The first one is a business called Advanced Plastic Recycling Composite. So what they do is they connect the pine wood waste anywhere. Like when you have the timber frame in the house, normally you will have offcuts. This sort of inevitable, unless you have very precise, design. But normally you have the offcuts, and then this cannot be reused again in the construction projects. So what they do is source them and make it like a flower, like wood flour.
Yeah.
And then they source the plastic waste from like what we always drink milk. So it's like 2 little milk bottles.
Yeah.
But what they receive is not the bottle itself, because there's a supply chain. I think Rachel also talked a bit about it. So there's a certain businesses in the supply chain. They take this milk bottle and then manufacture into a pellets. So basically, this business take these pellets and then melt it together with the wood flour, and then use the high pressure and high temperature to make it into the building components. Right. So what we have seen is like bonnets, the garden decking, wheel stopper, all these kind of components can be used by those kind of materials.
Right, and so they would feel like a hybrid between plastic and wood.
And wood.
Yeah, right. And so what kind of, you've mentioned like benches or components to a building, and how many, can you give us a quantifiable idea of how many, say, milk bottles would be needed for a bench?
Yeah, for what they call eco bench, which means they use this kind of materials to make the bench. So roughly for each bench, they use about 1,000, probably not quite, but 180 bottles, like 2-liter milk bottles.
Right.
So which is quite huge. If you take into account the volume, it's about 2.7 cubic meters of the plastic in terms of volume. So that's a huge.
And that's great, because there'd be thousands of those bottles lying around.
Yeah.
That's incredible. That's so clever.
Yeah.
What about, I know you've talked to me briefly about asphalt.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the second example is another local business called Donna. Or it's not just local. They have the businesses elsewhere, even globally. So what they do is they produce the asphalt. So they have the asphalt mix in place. So what they do is to actually introduce the printer cartridge and also the soft plastic bags into the asphalt mix. So by doing that, we can, rather than sending this to the landfill, we can actually use it in the asphalt. And B, we can replace those materials we normally will put into the asphalt mix. So we actually achieve double benefits of that. And the other thing what they're doing is quite interesting is what they call the reclaim the bitumen from the recycling the asphalt. So because they are asphalt producer or manufacturer, so they do need to use the bitumen quite a lot. By taking back those asphalt from the repair or maintenance, they actually can reclaim quite big percentage of that bitumen from that process.
Beautiful, so many benefits.
And that, and bear in mind that a large percentage of our bitumen we source from overseas.
Right.
So by doing that, we can cut the carbon emission from like transportation. A lot of them come from the sea transport. Yeah.
That's amazing. And so what do your personal research efforts, where do they sort of fit into all of this amazing stuff going on?
Sure. So because I'm very interested in how to achieve the sustainable construction. So we recognize, or it's well recognized, is this cannot be achieved by single person or even single type of business. So we see this as an opportunity that everyone in this kind of ecosystem we can work together. And one of the important things I think Rachel also talked about is the kind of business model or the recognition of the value of doing each piece in this supply chain or in the ecosystem. So what I'm very interested in trying to do is to look at as a holistic approach to look at how this individual component can work together holistically to achieve that goal.
Right, so you're kind of pulling in all the moving parts together and trying to...
It's very dynamic, and Rachel also talking about this, quite different stakeholders involved, every stakeholder make a move, and that may motivate other people to make a move. So it's not 1+1, it's actually going to be quite dynamic, so which will be quite interesting to see. Yeah.
Wow, Jian, it sounds incredibly complex, like there's lots of moving parts, but that it's really hopeful and exciting. It's incredible work that you do in the construction space, and Rachel as well, the single-use plastics and all those incredible alternatives. It's exciting to know that SA is at the very forefront of all of that exciting stuff going on. So thank you for your time on the Discovery Pod today, and thank you for your great work. Thanks for listening to the Discovery Pod, brought to you by the University of Adelaide. Join us next time when we discuss cancer research.